If some lawyer had obtained from a magistrate a writ of habeas corpus in Napoleon's favor in accordance with the Magna Carta Libertatum of 1215 and the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, the consequences might have proved peculiarly embarrassing. But one other question arose by the choice of St. Helena as the place of deportation. We already suggested, wrote an English journalist whose article of August 3rd was reprinted in Paris by the Aristarch, the only paper left of Fouché since the suppression of the Indépendant on July 31st, the only arm with which he fought reaction. We have already suggested that to legalize the detention of Bonaparte in England, it was necessary to pass an act of parliament to that effect. The same step is indispensable to confine him in an English settlement, however legal and even necessary such a measure may be. It is nevertheless, in a constitutional sense, the greatest innovation in the laws of England since our Constitution has been brought to the state of perfection in which it exists today. Actually, this innovation is to transform an English settlement into a state jail in which we shall detain for life a dethroned sovereign, for he has been universally recognized as a sovereign. It would not be the slightest innovation on our part to detain thus an English individual for transgressing in a not very serious manner the laws of this land, and to act as jailers in the name of those who believe themselves most wrong. If this was the opinion expressed by journalists of the opposition, the current of opinion which ran through the country was certainly very strong. The arrivals of Plymouth increased daily, so much so that they became a nuisance. From every corner of England came people hoping to see Napoleon. On Sunday the 30th, wrote Maitland, the number of boats was greater than I had even seen. I am sure I'm not exaggerating when I estimate that there were nearly 1,000 round hours ship in each of which on the average there were no less than 8 people to disperse them. Measures of a brutal kind were taken, propelled by oars. The guard sloops endeavored to ram these light craft in such a way that if they connected, the latter sank. And this really happened. Idle curiosity changed to enthusiasm. Women carried in their corsage red carnations and made bouquets of them and cheered just as loudly as the men. Was this to be tolerated? Further, Lord Keith was informed that a writ had been obtained from a magistrate ordering Bonaparte to be landed, and that a lawyer was on his way officially to make it known to him. But some days must yet elapse, firstly, so that the treaty with Europe determining the fate of the emperor might be signed, and secondly, the Bellerophon not being in a fit state to undertake the voyage to St. Helena, so that the Northumberland, which must conduct him there, might be fully ready. What could be done? Bonaparte is giving us a lot of trouble at Plymouth, Lord Liverpool wrote to Lord Castlereagh on August 3rd. We have been obliged to give orders by telegraphy to the vessel to cruise about until the Northumberland can start its voyage. We have had abundant proof that it would have been utterly impracticable to confine him there without the most serious disadvantages, and on the 4th, finding, according to the report made by Sir Harry Bunbury upon his arrival yesterday in the letters written by Lord Keith, that considerable inconvenience was being caused by the crowds of people in the bay at Plymouth, as well as by a spirit of antagonism shown by certain of Bonaparte's companions. We have sent by telegraph and repeated by express messenger in order that the Bellerophon, accompanied by the Tonnant and the other vessels, should immediately take to the open sea to cruise about without re-entering the port. The Northumberland set out from Portsmouth yesterday, but as the wind is contrary, it will not reach Plymouth until tomorrow. But I will hope it will take off the passengers without re-entering any port, but the wind is fresh, and they may be obliged to go to Torbay. Lord Keith mentions in today's letter that the visitors have been less troublesome, especially since the sloops of the warships sank a boat and drowned a man. The Bellerophon forthwith took to sea, and the enthusiasm consequently died away. The English navy thus had the distinction of drowning an Englishman, as well as rendering ineffective the lawyer bearing a subpoena ordering Bonaparte to appear as witness before the court of the king's bench. Then all the soups of the vessels in the roads towed the Bellerophon, beset with adverse wind and tide. A small vessel was detached with orders not to allow any vessel coming from the shore to approach. The lawyer then turned upon Lord Keith, whose aid he tried to enlist in his mission. The admiral stole away through a hidden door, literally hurled himself into a canoe, followed in the rear by a bearer of the writ who had also procured a boat. The admiral went aboard the Tonnant, crossed its deck, and descended the other side. As the man scaled the other, he was followed almost to the castle, but being in a 12-oared boat, he outdistanced the lawyer, turning round near Rame Head, and boarded the Prometheus, on which he hoisted his flag, expecting the Tonnant to rejoin him. The heads of the English navy, like the ministers, were assailed by the anxiety that if they were accosted by this bearer of a paper, the contents of which they were ignorant, but which they must obey if approached by him, it was sufficient to discern what was in their very conscience the violation of the Constitution and the abuse of strength. This was at noon on August 4th. On the 2nd at Paris, similar treaties were signed between Great Britain and Austria, Great Britain and Russia, Great Britain and Prussia. They were drawn up as follows: in the name of the holiest and undivided Trinity, Napoleon Bonaparte being in the hands of the Allied powers, their majesties have agreed according to clauses in the treaty of the 25th of March, 1815, upon the most likely measures to make impossible all interference from him in the peace of Europe. 1. Napoleon Bonaparte is regarded by the powers who signed the treaty of March 25th last as their prisoner. 2nd, his custody is especially entrusted to the British government. The choice of the place and of the means most likely to ensure the aim of the present agreement are left to His Britannic Majesty. 3. The imperial courts of Austria and Russia and the royal court of Prussia will appoint commissioners who will live in the place selected by the government of His Britannic Majesty for the abode of Napoleon, who, without being entrusted with his person, will make sure of his presence. 4. His most Christian Majesty will be invited in the name of the 4 courts thereto mentioned, likewise to send a commissioner to the palace of Napoleon Bonaparte's captivity. 5. His Majesty the King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland undertakes to fulfill the obligations laid upon him by this agreement. This was the law decreed by Europe without invoking any other law than that of force, without entering into the question whether Napoleon was England's prisoner or guest. He is in the possession of the Allied powers. That was enough. The treaty concluded on the 25th of March by the latter, a treaty based on the allegation of facts materially false and refuted point by point by the Imperial Council of State, could only invest the act with a semblance of truth, an act without parallel in history, and one for which they took the responsibility on the confession of the signatories. Even England and Russia between themselves, the Treaty of Fontainebleau had been violated by King Louis XVIII in all its clauses regarding Napoleon, and the latter, to escape misery, abduction, ever-present threats of assassination, to regain his wife and child, to ensure the livelihood of his parents and his servants, had no other intention than that of returning to the possession of the states. He had abdicated by this treaty. He had satisfied all the clauses as far as he was concerned. None of them had been carried out. None of them existed. In law, his position was unassailable. A contract of them existed. In law, one of the parties to it refuses altogether to fulfill the onerous clauses, while at the same time takes the profits, but Napoleon was beyond the law, and this was brought home to him in putting him beyond the pale of political and social relations, and in declaring that as an enemy and a disturber of the peace of the world, he had been delivered up to public vengeance. What did this matter to Europe? The powers had participated in the Treaty of Fontainebleau. It was by them that this treaty had been concluded and signed. They had deputed its performance to the provisional government, then to the King of France, who, one after the other, had explicitly and formally recognized it and accepted its conditions. The powers might therefore have forced the King of France to keep his promises. Not at all. It was Napoleon who was delivered up to the vengeance for having retaken what belonged to him. That was how, for the European sovereign suburbans had lately become the keystone of the building, they were considered as essentially representing divine right and the monarchical system, and so little were they liked. So lightly were they regarded, their loyalty so little trusted, that their restoration at the moment when Europe had given them kings was a condition, the proof, the very definition of its victory. Quite recently, the royal solidarity had been revealed to him. Certain people who had not believed in it a year previous, when they considered a Bernadotte for King of France, were so taken with it now that everything else took second place. If undertakings assumed with the Bourbons turned out to be valid, those with such men as Bonaparte and Murat were not. Opposite them, there was only the good pleasure of the European oligarchy, by whom the most solemn undertakings were annulled, the quality of their dispositions changed, and their character transformed. It was sufficient that, in the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity, the ministers of the sovereigns decreed that Napoleon Bonaparte had violated the Treaty of Fontainebleau, so that this violation should be his responsibility. And in addition to being Europe's prisoner, the hospitality which he requested from England should rightly become his captivity, if, however, to break its own laws whilst preserving the hypocritical appearance of a hospitable, generous nation, England had retired behind Europe. She would not have cared, having fulfilled her object, if Europe had persisted in its measures against Napoleon, if she had not been able to stifle the idea of commissioners appointed by the powers and resident at St. Helena, because it had been first suggested by Castlereagh himself. She took care by the text of the same agreements to reduce their mission to one merely of vouching for the existence of Napoleon. The same principles of economy which the ministers had then declared had disappeared in the face of this unshakable desire, singularly to dispose of the emperor. Liverpool, having drawn from the appointment of commissioners the conclusion that Napoleon, being the prisoner of Europe, must be accounted for by Europe, Castlereagh had no difficulty in getting him to give up the idea of demanding that division of expenses by which the Allies were empowered to exercise control and supervision. England, who alone would profit from Europe's victory, who, on Napoleon's fall, secured for at least a century the control of the sea. England, who alone for 20 years kept on a war, the result of which she knew could actually defray the cost of the prison. But there were certain formalities to be observed, and English hypocrisy then surpassed itself. The ministry might find itself in trouble for having resorted to compulsion and for having detained Napoleon Bonaparte in an unjust captivity, but if England, under these circumstances, only acted as a delegate of Europe, would not the ministry be shielded by this Congress of Sovereigns which evoked the Holy Trinity? Napoleon was at least obliged to protest. On the 4th, he wrote the protest, in which the following day he sent to Maitland and Keith, "I here solemnly protest before heaven and mankind against the compulsion to which I am subjected, against the violation of my most sacred rights in disposing by force of my person and my liberty. I went freely aboard the Bellerophon. I am not England's prisoner, but her guest. I even went at the instigation of the captain, who told me that he had instructions from his government to receive me and conduct me, if agreeable to me, to England with my suite. If the government, in giving me these instructions, to the captain of the Bellerophon to receive me thus with my suite, intended merely to lay a snare for me, it has forfeited its honor and disgraced its flag. I appeal to history. It will say that an enemy who for 20 years waged war against the English people came voluntarily to them in his misfortune to seek refuge in their loss. What proof more glaring could he give of his esteem and confidence? But how did England respond to this gesture? It feigned to proffer him a hospitable land and then sacrificed him. These words live. History accepts them as the true and positive relation of events. How Napoleon related the obstacles to going to sea and making for America. How he was obliged to leave Rochefort and the island of Aix. How earth and sea shut behind him, which had nothing to do with what Maitland said and did. The latter and Admiral Sir Henry Hotham had received him and treated him as a guest. His status could not be altered by the simple fact that it pleased the English ministry to change it. Even if Europe agreed to become its accessory, this fact dominated the whole captivity of Napoleon. It declared the unrighteousness of it and explained its sudden turns of fortune. It characterized the struggle Napoleon waged with his jailers. Henceforth, regarded as a prisoner, the abdicated emperor could no longer adhere to his incognito, which might have been allowed him as a guest. He claimed all the distinctions with which the French people had voluntarily overwhelmed him. He claimed the holy unction with which the Pope had anointed him. He claimed his title of emperor and recognition of imperial majesty, which all the European sovereigns had accorded him, under the penalty of forfeiting himself, under the penalty of disinheriting his son from that imaginary succession to what might be the empire of the world, under the obligation of recognizing and asserting that all that the French nation had done for the past 20 years was unlawful. In the prison in which England, carrying out the orders of Europe, was going to confine him and hold him, he was condemned by his conscience and by the power of national right from being forever emperor. It was emperor that he would be alone if necessary, and his companions, his guards, England and Europe, and with this last struggle of a man against a conspiring mankind, against the armies of 10 kings, their navies, and their resources, who will be victorious?